After sketching out the transport on paper, I decided to put it into Sketchup so I can measure some of the angles. Well, as it turned out, that was an unnecessary step, as you will find out later. So you can kind of see the cedar is curved, but it's not that bad. So I'm going to go ahead and plane this edge and make sure this top surface is flat, and then make one side of this perpendicular to the top surface. Got a couple of nails here as my poor man's version of the bench stop. The cedar was quite easy to plane with a sharp iron. And for anybody who's done hand planing, you know that planing by hand is something enjoyed by all 5 of the senses. I wanted the grains to be symmetrical, so I ripped a strip off each side of the cedar before gluing it back together. I believe this is the side of the transport. Even though only one side of the cedar was smooth and the other side looked like this, it doesn't take that much effort to plane this side to be nice and smooth, just like the other side. Planing something smooth was not that hard. In fact, it's quite enjoyable. But planing something flat using a scrub plane can be a very vigorous exercise. Now I'm going to try to lay out this shape onto this board right here. So when I was done with the layout, I didn't use this shape. I used more of this shape here to use less of the board. One thing I wasn't sure about was how accurate these cuts need to be for everything to fit together. So between the two where there are 11.5 inches, I left a gap. And this gap should be big enough for my saw curve. Most of the pieces were rough cut with a jigsaw, and the plane is used to take it down to the exact line. There are lots of advantages for using masking tape as a mock-up tool. There are also drawbacks. So this is the original angle that I had when I designed it, but upon looking at it, it doesn't look like it flares out that much. So I went ahead and took an 1/8 inch off one side on this side, and you can see the angle is much more attractive. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on this side as well.
I'm just eyeballing about 1/8 of an inch from the edge.
So this angle is going to get a little bit more extreme. Just going to use the bevel gauge to figure out what this angle is supposed to be and transfer it. I think it's about 20 degrees. But since everything has shifted, better just measure it off. This was the raw angle. I took the outside angle, but rather I should take the inside angle. And this is where I need to, this would be the right angle. Because of the location of some of these holes, I have to be very careful not to over tighten the screws. The screws came in very handy to align all the pieces together, but some of the larger pieces still needed clamps to make sure everything's nice and tight. End-grained miter joints are strong enough probably for picture frames, but definitely not for a toy box, so I decided to add some pegs to strengthen the whole structure. Some seams had showed up after the final glue up that were not there in the mock-up. This is probably because this was glued in several segments, so some pieces may have been shifted. I decided to take advantage of this by adding another color. In this case, it's a acrylic and epoxy mixture.
So we're using a plane to trim off the surface where the acrylic epoxy was. Seemed like a good idea, but the acrylic had weakened the structure of the epoxy and it started to melt, probably against the friction of the plane. So I decided to do bulk of the trimming with a chisel to avoid any sticky situation. The plane was very useful to get rid of the little bits of pegs that are still sticking out. And I was able to make sure that the edges are nice and flush, and where two planes meet, everything's nice and tight and clean. One of my concerns is where the two side walls may not be strong enough to withstand outward force. So I decided to add a dovetail as both a handle as well as to reinforce the two sides to make sure that they are nice and strong. The box itself needed to have pretty much no sharp corners. So wherever I could, I rounded over about a 1/4 inch everywhere I could reach with the router table. Some of the corners and edges are nearly impossible or inconvenient to get to with a router, so I just decided to use a rasp and a file to knock off the corners. Riddle me this: what has two thumbs and likes the sand? Not this guy. From the very beginning, I wanted to use the grains of the cedar. So when I was making the facets and the faces, everything is very specifically oriented, just so I can, in the end, really bring it out with some linseed oil. I applied about 3 coats of linseed oil, I think, and sanded in between the coats. For indoor projects, shellac is my finish of choice. I find it very forgiving, it's very easy to apply. It does have a little bit of smell, the smell of alcohol, if you're sensitive to that sort of stuff. But besides that, it's a wonderfully easy to use finish and very durable. Shellac on, shellac off, shellac on, shellac off. Look, sir! Droids!